The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid summer air that pressed against the windows of our small, cluttered living room. "You are a burden," she said. Not screamed, not whispered, but stated with a chilling clarity that cut deeper than any shout ever could. My daughter Sarah stood before me, her arms crossed, her eyes, usually so full of warmth and laughter, now cold, distant, and filled with a resentment I hadn't realized had festered so deeply. I felt a strange, almost out-of-body sensation. My breath caught, a sharp, painful gasp that no one heard, that the world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a moment, all the noise of our lives, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside, the incessant ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall, faded into an eerie silence. I remember the exact moment, the way the late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty blinds, illuminating the motes dancing in the air, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring within me. My hands, calloused from years of working, first in the factory, then struggling with odd jobs after the layoffs, twitched slightly. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close, to explain, to apologize for every perceived failing, for every sacrifice that had somehow become a burden instead of a gift. But I didn't. My muscles felt locked, my throat tight. Instead, a strange, almost involuntary smile touched my lips. It wasn't a happy smile, not a defiant one. It was the kind of smile that comes from a place beyond pain, a place of profound, shattering realization. It was the smile of a person who has just been handed a truth so brutal, so undeniable, that all resistance crumbles. Sarah saw it, that faint, unsettling curve of my mouth. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable, confusion, anger, crossing her face. She probably expected tears, an argument, a desperate plea for understanding. But there was none of that, just this quiet, almost serene acceptance. It was as if her words, meant to wound, had instead severed a cord, freeing me from an invisible tether I hadn't known existed. For years, my life had revolved around her, around providing, protecting, sacrificing. Every decision, every penny earned, every sleepless night had been for her future, for her happiness. I had worn my struggles like a badge of honor, believing that she, at least, understood the depth of my love, the weight of my efforts. But in that single, devastating sentence, she had stripped it all away, revealing the stark, unvarnished truth. My existence, my very presence, was a burden. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I could feel the echoes of her words reverberating in the hollow chambers of my chest. "You are a burden." It wasn't just a statement, it was an accusation, a verdict. And in that moment, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something had to change. Not just for her, but for me. I had lost myself somewhere along the way, buried under layers of responsibility and unspoken expectations. I had become a ghost in my own life, defined solely by my utility, or lack thereof, to others. The smile remained, a silent testament to the internal revolution that had just begun. It was the smile of a man who had finally hit rock bottom, and in the crushing impact, found a strange, terrifying clarity. This was it, the turning point, the moment I stopped being just a provider, a protector, a burden, and started to remember who I was, or at least who I needed to become. The papers were waiting. The papers. They lay on the kitchen counter, stark white against the worn laminate, a stack of legal documents that represented a future I had never truly considered. Divorce papers. My wife, Maria, had left them there a week ago. A silent ultimatum after months of escalating arguments, of cold shoulders and colder silences. She said I was stuck in the past, that I couldn't adapt, that my old ways were holding us back. She wanted a new life, a fresh start, one unburdened by the ghosts of our shared history and my perceived failures. I had been dragging my feet, clinging to the hope that something, anything, could be salvaged. But Sarah's words, delivered with such brutal honesty, had shattered that illusion. They were not just about me being a burden to her. They were about me being a burden to everyone, including myself. I walked slowly towards the kitchen, each step feeling heavy, deliberate. The house, once filled with the cacophony of family life, now felt hollow, echoing with unspoken words and unfulfilled dreams. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken resentments. I picked up the pen, its cool metal a stark contrast to the burning in my chest. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the decision. This wasn't just signing papers. It was signing away a life, a dream, a version of myself I had clung to for decades. It was acknowledging the end of an era, the collapse of a foundation I had believed unshakable. As I looked at the documents, memories flooded my mind. Maria, radiant on our wedding day, her laughter echoing through the church. Sarah, a tiny bundle in my arms, her fingers curling around mine, a promise of a future I was determined to build. The small house we bought, the endless nights I worked overtime to make ends meet, the sacrifices I made, believing they were investments in our collective happiness. Where had it all gone wrong? Was it the factory closing, leaving me adrift in a sea of uncertainty? Was it my inability to embrace the new economy, the digital world that seemed to leave me behind? Or was it something deeper, a slow erosion of connection, a gradual drifting apart that neither of us had the courage to acknowledge until it was too late? The pen hovered over the signature line. My name, John Miller, seemed alien, detached from the man I had become. Who was John Miller now? A husband on the brink of divorce, a father deemed a burden, a man adrift in a world he no longer recognized. The weight of those labels pressed down on me, suffocating. But then, a strange sense of defiance began to stir. If I was a burden, then I would shed that weight. If I was stuck, I would break free. If this was the end of one chapter, then it was also the beginning of another. A blank page, terrifying in its emptiness, but also exhilarating in its potential. I thought of Sarah again, her cold eyes, her cutting words. They were a mirror, reflecting back a truth I had refused to see. I had become complacent, comfortable in my misery, clinging to the familiar even when it was slowly suffocating me. Her words, though painful, were a catalyst, a brutal awakening. They forced me to confront the reality that my life as it was unsustainable. I couldn't continue to live in a state of quiet desperation, hoping things would magically improve. I had to act. I had to choose. With a deep, shuddering breath, I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed, dark and resolute, forming the familiar loops and lines of my signature. Each stroke was a declaration, a commitment to a path unknown. It wasn't an act of surrender, it was an act of liberation. The moment the pen lifted from the paper, a strange lightness filled the room. The suffocating air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a faint breeze of possibility. The ticking of the grandfather clock no longer sounded like a countdown to doom, but a steady rhythm of a new beginning. I had signed the papers, and in doing so, I had signed my own Declaration of Independence. The old John Miller was gone. The new one was about to emerge, raw and uncertain but undeniably free. The days that followed were a blur of practicalities and emotional upheaval. Maria moved out, taking with her half of the furniture and a significant portion of my emotional landscape. Sarah, after her outburst, retreated into a sullen silence, communicating mostly through curt nods and monosyllabic answers. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence amplifying my own thoughts, forcing me to confront the wreckage of my life. I spent hours staring at the walls, at the empty spaces where pictures once hung, at the faint outlines of furniture that had been removed. Each empty space was a reminder of what was lost, but also, surprisingly, an invitation for what could be. I started with the small things, cleaning out the garage, a task I had put off for years. It was a repository of forgotten projects, broken tools, and dusty memories. As I sorted through the clutter, I found old photographs, a younger, happier me, Maria with a mischievous glint in her eye, Sarah as a toddler, her face smeared with cake. Each image was a pang, a bittersweet ache in my chest. But instead of dwelling on the pain, I tried to see them as lessons, as stepping stones. What had I learned from those moments? What had I gained even in the loss? One afternoon, while sifting through a box of old books, I stumbled upon a journal I had kept in my 20s. It was filled with youthful dreams, aspirations of travel, of creating something meaningful, of living a life of purpose beyond the daily grind. I had forgotten that version of myself, the one who believed anything was possible. The factory job, then the marriage, then the responsibilities of fatherhood, they had slowly, imperceptibly, chipped away at that idealism, replacing it with a pragmatic resignation. Reading those old entries was like meeting a stranger, a vibrant, hopeful stranger who had somehow gotten lost along the way. This rediscovery sparked something within me, a flicker of that old fire, a yearning for the person I used to be, or perhaps the person I was always meant to be. I realized that for too long, I had defined myself by my roles: husband, father, provider, and when those roles shifted or were challenged, I had no core identity to fall back on. Sarah's words, "You are a burden," had stripped away those roles, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, but also, paradoxically, free to redefine myself. I began to walk, long, aimless walks through the neighborhood, then through the local park, and eventually, along the trails of the nearby state forest. The rhythm of my footsteps, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the fresh air filling my lungs, it was a form of meditation, a way to quiet the incessant chatter of my mind. I observed the trees, the way they stood firm against the wind, their roots deeply embedded yet their branches reaching towards the sky. I saw resilience, growth, and an unwavering connection to something larger than themselves. During these walks, I started to think about what burden truly meant. Was it financial? Emotional? A drain on energy? And if I was a burden, what was the opposite of that? A contribution? A source of strength? A light? The questions swirled in my mind, pushing me towards a deeper introspection. I realized that being a burden wasn't just about what I took. It was about what I wasn't giving. I wasn't giving my best self. I wasn't living authentically. I wasn't pursuing my own passions. And in doing so, I was inadvertently stifling those around me, including Sarah. My stagnation had become their burden. The realization was both painful and liberating. It wasn't about blaming Sarah or Maria. It was about taking responsibility for my own life, for my own choices, for the path I had allowed myself to drift onto. The echoes of the past were still there, the hurt, the regret, the sense of loss. But now, intertwined with those echoes, were whispers of the future, whispers of possibility, of growth, of a chance to rewrite my story. The empty house, the signed papers, the silence, they were no longer symbols of defeat but blank canvases waiting for me to paint a new life. The biggest battle wasn't with Maria, or even with Sarah. It was with myself. The internal critic, the voice that whispered doubts and fears, was relentless. "You're too old," it would say. "You've lost your chance. What do you even know how to do anymore?" It was a constant barrage, threatening to pull me back into the familiar comfort of inertia. But something had shifted. Sarah's words, harsh as they were, had ignited a spark of defiance. I wasn't going to let that voice win, not this time. I started small. I enrolled in an online course on digital marketing, something completely outside my comfort zone. The first few weeks were a struggle. The terminology was foreign, the concepts abstract. I felt like a dinosaur trying to navigate a spaceship. There were moments of frustration, moments when I wanted to quit, to throw my laptop across the room and retreat into the familiar world of manual labor. But then I would remember Sarah's face, her cold eyes, and the burning desire to prove her wrong, not just to her but to myself, would reignite. I spent late nights hunched over my computer, poring over articles, watching tutorials, trying to grasp the intricacies of SEO and social media algorithms. My eyes would ache, my back would protest, but I pushed through. I was learning again, truly learning, for the first time in decades. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and deeply satisfying. Each small victory, understanding a complex concept, successfully completing a coding exercise, was a tiny chip away at the burden I had become. I was building something new, brick by digital brick. One evening, Sarah came home from school, her usual sullen expression in place. She glanced at my screen, where a complex spreadsheet of analytics was open. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tinged with a rare curiosity. "Learning," I replied, without looking up, trying to figure out how to make sense of all this. She didn't say anything more, but I felt her presence linger for a moment longer than usual before she retreated to her room. It was a small interaction, almost imperceptible, but it was a crack in the wall she had built between us. My progress wasn't linear. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, when the sheer volume of information seemed insurmountable. There were moments of self-doubt when I questioned whether I was truly capable of this reinvention, but I kept going. I remembered the journal, the dreams of my younger self. I remembered the feeling of signing those papers, the liberation that came with letting go. This wasn't just about a new career. It was about reclaiming my life, my purpose, my identity. I started attending online networking events, forcing myself to interact with people half my age, people who spoke a language I was just beginning to understand. It was awkward at first, filled with stilted conversations and forced smiles. But gradually, I began to find my footing. I discovered that my life experience, my resilience, my ability to adapt, even if slowly, were valuable assets. I wasn't just an old man trying to catch up. I was a seasoned individual bringing a unique perspective to a new field. The first breakthrough came when I landed a small freelance project, helping a local small business optimize their online presence. It wasn't much, just a few $100s, but it felt like $1 million. It was tangible proof that I wasn't a burden, that I could contribute, that I had value. I remember the thrill of seeing my work go live, of knowing that I had created something that helped someone else. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of accomplishment that went beyond a paycheck. I was still living in the same house, still navigating the complexities of co-parenting with Maria, still dealing with Sarah's fluctuating moods, but something fundamental had changed within me. The weight was lifting. The burden was transforming into a challenge, an opportunity. I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I was building. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with unknowns, but for the first time in a long time I was walking it with purpose, with a quiet determination that had been missing for far too long. The battle was far from over, but I had taken the first, crucial step. Months turned into a year. My freelance work grew slowly but steadily. I wasn't rich, but I was self-sufficient, building a new life brick by digital brick. The house, once a monument to loss, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could create, learn, and grow. The silence that once suffocated me now offered a peaceful canvas for my thoughts. I had found a new rhythm, a new purpose, one that was entirely my own. The biggest change, however, wasn't in my finances or my career. It was in my relationship with Sarah. The wall between us didn't crumble overnight, but it began to soften, brick by painful brick. She would occasionally ask about my work, about the internet stuff I was doing. I would explain patiently, enthusiastically, sharing my small victories and my ongoing challenges. She started to see me not just as dad, but as a person, someone who was actively pursuing something, someone who was learning and growing. One evening, she came into the living room while I was working. She sat on the old armchair, the one Maria had left behind, and watched me for a long time. I could feel her gaze, but I didn't look up immediately. When I finally did, her eyes, once so cold, held a flicker of something new. Respect. "You know," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "You seem happier." The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between us. I smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile this time. "I am, sweetie," I replied. "I really am." It wasn't an apology, not from her, not from me. It didn't need to be. The unspoken understanding was far more powerful. She saw that I had taken her words, those painful, cutting words, and transformed them. I hadn't just survived, I had thrived. I had shed the burden, not by running from it, but by confronting it, by redefining myself. She saw the resilience, the quiet strength that had emerged from the ashes of my old life. And in seeing that, she began to see herself differently too. Our conversations became more frequent, more open. We talked about her dreams, her fears, her struggles with school and friends. I listened, truly listened, without judgment, without trying to fix everything. I was no longer just her father. I was a fellow traveler on the journey of life, someone who understood what it meant to face challenges and to find strength within. The burden had been lifted, not just from her, but from me. I was no longer carrying the weight of unspoken expectations, of perceived failures. I was simply John, living my life, pursuing my passions, and in doing so, inspiring my daughter to do the same. The papers I had signed that day, the ones that changed everything, were not just divorce papers. They were liberation papers. They were the catalyst for a profound transformation, a rebirth. I had faced the deepest fear, being deemed worthless, a burden, and emerged stronger, clearer, and more authentically myself than I had ever been. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer walking it alone, weighed down by the past. I was walking it with purpose, with hope, and with the quiet understanding that sometimes the most painful words can be the greatest gifts, pushing us towards the life we were always meant to live.